Over the last century, there's always been some kind of looming threat that has led us to feel vulnerable and fuels public paranoia of an invasion, whether it be domestically or culturally. Cinema has helped give us a visual medium to express our feelings. With the popularity of the movies, with thousands going out each week to watch them, it makes it one of the widest and most accessible art forms for creators to express their fears. Horror films in particular create villains out of our insecurities, and as you'll see, they were and still are used as ways to show political messages, warning us of the dangers of stepping too far out of line. They allow us a gateway into our past like no other. They not only show us what terrified them at the time, but also shows how they dealt with it. For this video I've chosen 3 specific time periods: the 1950s, the 1960s through 70s, and the 1980s. While it may seem a bit strange to pick those over something more modern, the warnings and messages are so vital to the stories at the time, they're arguably the most identifiable and iconic to choose from. From the Red Scare to the Invisible Enemy, let's have a look at how society's anxieties have influenced the horror genre in the last century. During the 1950s, the world was quickly recovering from the largest war it had ever seen, and America was entering a new atomic age where everything from flying cars to space travel seemed just on the horizon. However, under the surface, tensions between the US and the USSR were reaching their boiling point. Each side wanted to prove they were the superior country, and the threat of nuclear war or a full-on invasion from the outside or within was on a lot of people's minds. Before I go any further, it'd be important to talk about what the horror genre actually was in this generation. Science fiction had seen a boom in popularity, with cheaper ways to get your hands on serials and magazines that specialise in all things sciencey, as well as the lines between science fiction and science fact becoming thinner every single day. This, and the realisation of the power of the atomic bomb used during World War II, people getting worried about what else science could be capable of if in the wrong hands. This led to the two genres fusing together, and the effects would be felt for the next few decades. When it came to mainstream Hollywood, gone were the vampires and ghost stories, and in its place were monsters that were affected by atomic radiation, wreaking destruction on suburban America, such as Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and Tarantula, or men mutating their bodies into hideous, inhuman creations like the Amazing Colossal Man and The Fly. This new wave of science-based horror, directly inspired by the destruction that was brought on Japan, was a metaphor for the dangers that these weapons posed on Middle America as these monsters trampled cities and attacked small communities. But it wasn't only what was on this planet that frightened us, but what was beyond the stars. With the space race in full swing, and numerous emerging high-profile accounts of UFO sightings, horror films started to focus on alien invaders bent on destroying or controlling our minds to create a new, perfect, uniform society without love, patriotism, or individuality. It's hard not to see this as a metaphor for the looming threat of the Soviet Union, as the communists favoured the needs of the community rather than the self, which was a stark contradiction to the more capitalist way of life the Americans had gotten used to. Arguably, two of the most infamous metaphors for the incoming Soviet threat are the thing from another world and the invasion of the body snatchers. In the former, a group of scientists are trapped in the Antarctic with a hulking alien who threatens society if it were to make it off the base they're stuck on. This forces our heroes to band together to fight off the invading menace. The patriotic theme is arguably its most clear in the film's closing monologue, as Scott briefs the news about what happened there that night.
All right, fellas, here's your story. North Pole, November 3rd. Ned Scott reporting. One of the world's greatest battles was fought and won today by the human race. Here at the top of the world, a handful of American soldiers and civilians met the first invasion from another planet.
He describes the people as war heroes, fighting off the alien invasion, detailing those who have suffered casualties, comparing them to stories of the Bible, saving the world with an arc of electricity instead of wood. He finishes with a stark warning to the people.
Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world, tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
This speech not only holds up the conservative religious viewpoint of the American government of the time, but it also warns the people to keep looking, a possible statement on the increased level of espionage at the time, implying that the threat, like space, is all around us. Invasion of the Body Snatchers also finishes with this pro-government agenda, as the main character is seen hurling himself into traffic trying to warn people that the alien invaders are here and they're coming for the audience. Even with this pretty clear attempt to boost paranoia of the incoming communist invasion, the film ends with doctors trying to warn the government to get ready as the invasion is spreading, and they need to be prepared to block off and eradicate this threat as soon as possible.
operative. Get me the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Yes, it's an emergency.
While the 50s was a time fueled by the need to preserve the American way of life, the next few decades are all about social change. People had grown past the fear of the Red Invasion, with the 60s, 70s and 80s bringing in a boom of cultural revolutions. With civil rights coming to the forefront of US politics, there was one area that still remained prevalent throughout horror films, and that was the idea of free love. Americans were slowly becoming disinterested in the idea of long-term relationships, with divorce rates rising significantly, and the invention of a contraceptive pill allowed for much more sexual freedom. While films like Psycho took some early steps in portraying the more voyeuristic times, by having a likeable but still flawed heroine actively engaging in marital affairs during broad daylight and even some scenes of partial nudity, films such as the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers paint a very different story, with the film's theme revolving more around the dangers that this freer attitude to sexuality can have on society. The invading pod people, while looking and acting somewhat like regular humans, strive for a society that they see as perfect, one in which we're all joined together where things such as love have little to no value. The overnight transformation of these characters could be seen in how love in a relationship fades over time until the person in question falls out of love and then rejects the idea of long-term relationships and marriage. Our heroes, with their organic love for each other, seem to be the ones that are going to save the day until they both eventually succumb to this new alien threat. With the film's iconic ending, Donald Sutherland screams into the camera, showing that he too has given in to this new agenda. Through the next 5 years, fear of free love remained at the forefront of horror until a new invisible threat began to surface, one that changed the world and the horror genre for decades. The rise of HIV and AIDS presented an epidemic that the world had never really seen before. Yes, there had been other illnesses which had killed millions, but none that could be transferred through blood or by sexual contact. The effects of a virus aren't pretty either. It attacks the immune system, leaving the victim vulnerable to infections or even other diseases, letting the body waste away slowly and painfully. Reflecting back, the way it seemingly made the human body unrecognisable somewhat assisted in the birth of a new subgenre, the body horror. When talking about this, David Cronenberg is normally the first director that springs to mind. His films feature heavy gore and mature themes, and some of his films have acted as commentaries for American society, such as Videodrome talking about the effects of violent TV on the human mind. However, many consider his masterpiece to be 1986's The Fly, a remake of the 1950s original. Where this differs from the other is how the transformation is portrayed, as Vincent Price's metamorphosis is more hidden from the audience. We know it's happening, however it's saved for one moment of shock at the end. In Cronenberg's version, we see every last little gritty detail. We see Brundle change both physically and mentally until he literally becomes an unrecognisable horror. This slow, physical transformation we see is where a lot of people compare it to the AIDS virus, even though the director himself has openly denied it many times. We watch as he loses his humanity bit by bit until we hardly recognise him anymore. He's a shell of his former self until he begs his loved ones for his suffering to finally end. Although less argued, another remake of a 1950s film, John Carpenter's The Thing, also has some potential themes referencing the epidemic. The obvious comparison is to mention the body horror transformations as the best evidence, however there are two more interesting theories. During the 1980s, the disease was stereotypically associated with the gay community, so having the entire cast be male, with a parasite transferring between them, is some form of evidence. The second is the infamous blood test scene, where they use blood to try and identify who is transformed into a thing, being a possible metaphor for the other most common way to attract the disease. While it took a few years for the filmmaking community to treat the disease with some form of respect in mainstream Hollywood, these films, in their grotesque, inhuman depictions of physical change, amplified the conditions of the HIV and AIDS virus to help fuel public hysteria and warn them what catching the disease could do to them. We've seen the West paralysed by anxieties of a communist invasion, we've seen how the idea of free love scared 70s America, and we've seen how fear of a virus that changes us physically has made us much more fearful of our bodies, and how these have all influenced the horror genre over the last few decades. The important question is, why is it so important for us to know this? While some may be quick to question the legitimacy of these claims, stating that it's white conservative critics pushing their own anxieties onto these films, I believe as a creator, understanding the past is crucial to changing the future. As pretentious as that sounds, seeing how these fears were perceived at the time, it will allow us to develop new ways to express those issues. It can show us how much we've changed our attitudes towards certain issues. For example, gay film writers took offence to how the AIDS epidemic was being plastered on The Fly's themes and visuals, which arguably led to films like Philadelphia that took a much more grounded and realistic approach to portraying the virus. Or, on the other hand, it could do the opposite. With post 9/11 horror, we found ourselves back to the evil invader storylines, but instead of aliens from a distant planet, we now have zombies, vampires and ghosts which aim to attack us domestically and from within. What the future holds is uncertain. Films such as Get Out and Unfriended are bringing in a new wave of political and social horror films that focus on our views on race and cybersecurity respectively. All we know is for sure, if you haven't got anything to be afraid of, look around you. You may be surprised.